Okay, so why don't we start talking about Hegel? So my syllabus is unusual in that we move forward in the history of philosophy to Nietzsche, who you may have ascertained is in one respect rather destructive, but he seems to more or less undermine, or at least attempt to undermine the various sorts of ethical doctrine that we studied in the history spanning from Plato through John Stuart Mill, right? And for that reason, Nietzsche is in some way virtually outside of the tradition of ethics, reflecting on it, challenging it, and compelling us to think more deeply about it. And it's after confronting that challenge that we gain from Nietzsche that I think it's fruitful to go back to another thinker who preceded Nietzsche. His name is, in English, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, from my approximation to German pronunciation. He was born in 1770, okay, and died in 1831. And he's the great figure after Kant. There were two interceding figures. I have them here for you. Gottlieb Fichte, who's no slouch, and F.W.J. Schelling. Hegel worked very closely with Schelling. Both of them were admirers of Fichte. And Fichte effectively responded to the philosophy of Kant, right? All of them together, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, are known as German idealists, okay? And German idealism is precisely a post-Kantian movement. It's not against Kant. They're trying to, particularly Fichte and Schelling, they're trying to work out the implications of Kant. You might say, as we move through this triad, Fichte is trying to self-consciously work out a Kantian sort of system, but he's pressing it in ways that Kant didn't, right? And he would say things that would probably cause, I think did cause Kant some discomfiture before Kant passed on in 1804. That was, by then, Fichte had the opportunity to publish several versions of his doctrine of science, he called it. Schelling is a little bit more distant from Kant, right? He's still in that area, but he is more concerned with a philosophy of nature, right? Kant had a philosophy of nature, but Schelling sort of begins with a philosophy of nature, which is very un-Kantian. And Hegel, one can suggest, is the furthest removed from Kant of the three, but he still retains some important Kantian insights, and we'll talk about those as the lecture unfolds, okay? So here's what they all have in common. They all take self-consciousness as the first principle and key to systematic philosophy. So there are a few concepts there, right? Self-consciousness. Well, think about yourself for a moment and how you take yourself to be responsible for your actions and responsible for your thoughts, right? That's the essence of self-consciousness, your ability to take yourself to be responsible for truth and falsity and for making good choices and acting on genuine moral norms, right? That we take now as a first principle. We take that kind of self-regulating self-consciousness as a first principle of philosophy. We're going to start talking about this. We haven't done that yet, right? We haven't begun. We've barely mentioned self-consciousness, except in Kant, of course. But even then, we didn't begin with the concept of self-consciousness. So now we're going to do that. It becomes a first principle. And it's a key to something else that we can't talk about extensively because we only have a limited amount of time, but systematic philosophy. But in connection with Hegel, we'll have to talk about this a bit. I'll at least have to give you a flavor of the flavor of Hegelian systematic philosophy. It was important for all these thinkers, for Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, that philosophy be systematic, that knowledge itself, if you like, have a kind of organic form. Okay? That's a peculiar thing to demand of knowledge. Why should it have an organic form? Why shouldn't it just be a series of arguments that demonstrate various conclusions? And the conclusions are what they are. Why do they have to fit together in something that looks like a living thing? It's a kind of peculiar claim. So we will return to it. So Self-consciousness was talked about in a book called De Anima by Aristotle, book 2, chapter 2. That's his explanation of the phenomenon of self-consciousness, and in Nicomachean Ethics, book 9, chapter 9. Okay, but it was kind of a side problem that earlier philosophers dealt with. So, let's see. Hegel takes the principle of self-consciousness. This is why he's the furthest distant from Kant. He takes this principle of self-consciousness, and then he says, okay, we'll start by considering it as a first principle, but then we have to press it all the way to the end. It has to be superseded by what he calls Geist, or mind. And that would be a sort of a network of self-conscious agents, all of whom, as it were, embody something objective, an objective set of norms and values and practices particularly, but also as realized eventually in the form of knowing, a kind of collective knowing. He calls Geist. You translate that with either mind or spirit, depending upon the context. So there's what I would call a thesis that's common to these German idealists, okay? And that is that the perfection of human life. So here we are, we're talking about something ethical, right? It sounds very Aristotelian and Thomist. Perfection of, and indeed, in the book that you'll be reading next, Hegel says it's actually a treatment of natural law. So if it's a treatment of natural law, a little bit surprising he would call it that at first. I'll explain later. If it's a treatment of natural law, we should look for basic goods in Hegel's treatment, and then we can deduce from the basic goods the rules that one must follow in order to achieve the basic goods, right? I think that what you encounter there, we'll get to that next week, is a kind of doctrine of basic goods, but the basic goods are not given by nature. We'll get back to that. The perfection of a human life consists in rational self-determination, right? Sounds like autonomy in Kant, right? Rational self-determination. B, in light of norms and values. C, that can be known to be objective and binding. And D, acted on in and through that knowledge, okay? And even Hegel will agree with this. But you only achieve this rational self-determination in light of norms and values, known to be objective and acted on in and through that knowledge. You only achieve that in here if you live in and are part of this kind of collective we call Geist. All right, collective self-consciousness. So now, can I add something about that? A Geist can degenerate into a mere mob, like a group of people assembled on a field, and they sort of immerse themselves in the feeling of the mob, a rock concert or something like that. Or I think today there's an internet mob. People sort of feel that they cleave to their internet community. Or media mob, they choose their particular media outlet, and they more or less parrot whatever talking points are fed to them by their opinion leaders on their favored media sources, right? Media organizations, whatever you call them. And I suggest as a thesis, there's something mob-like about it, that people collect together and relate to anonymous others who are watching the same show, right? Or the same broadcasts, and thus form something which reason is not governing them. Let me say that. Now, what Hegel means by Geist is not the mob, okay? That can degenerate into a mob, but by Geist he means something organized in institutions. That's much different. Geist is in its ideal form is rational, okay? Now, there are defective modes of Geist. We'll talk about that too. Now, before we get to Geist, we have to start with self-consciousness. And Hegel has a brilliant philosophy of self-consciousness, and also a brilliant critique of the limits of the principle of self-consciousness, okay? So let's try to walk through this. How about this question? How is it possible that an individual be conscious of himself or herself? I just got nervous and I'm wondering if this, the microphone is on. How can you be conscious of yourself? How is that possible? I mean, what do? Do you separate yourself from yourself and then look at yourself and say, hey, that's me? That's ridiculous, right? Okay, so let's back up for a second. There are two general possibilities. The first is that an individual somehow identifies himself or herself. Sort of what I said before. It does sound a little bit silly, but let's get to the second one. The second possibility is that an individual somehow constitutes himself or herself in and through a relation to distinct objects and other persons. Okay, now the first one sounds impossible. You can say the second one sounds impossible, right? Because you'd have to already be a self in order to constitute yourself, right? Follow? Nonetheless, it's this second alternative that Hegel argues for. And he says, no, you have to draw distinctions within selfhood such that self-constitution is possible. There's a moment within selfhood that's not yet the self. And it's an activity of determining itself through another, such that a self emerges from that activity. Okay, so that doesn't make any clear sense at the moment, but we'll explain that by the time we're done. So let's look at the identification model of consciousness. Let's start there. Let's just kind of dig into it and see if we can defend it nonetheless. So according to this model, every time an individual is conscious of himself or herself, that is in virtue of his or her identifying himself or herself. I don't think I read that correctly. Every time an individual is conscious of himself or herself, that is in virtue of his identifying himself or herself in the way that you would identify an avocado in your field of vision. So you can pick yourself out in your field of consciousness as a broader field, right? You can pick yourself out and distinguish yourself from the number 7, or your thought of God, from your experience of a symphony, whatever it may be. So there are at least 3 objections that can be brought against this self-identification model. The SI isn't there a car with an SI option on it, Mitsubishi or something like that, or Nissan? I can't remember. For a being to identify itself, it would first have to separate itself from itself and then confront itself as existing over and against itself, and then identify itself. Identify this second self instance as being itself. Okay, so if this SI model is going to work, it has to be something like that. There's self-separation and identification of the self instance that has been separated. Here's the problem. No being can separate itself from itself. It's a big problem. Right? Try right now. Try to separate yourself from yourself and put yourself opposite yourself. I don't mean like bodily or anything of that sort. If you can take your very selfhood, have a look at it somewhere in your consciousness, just look at that selfhood opposite yourself and see if you can succeed at that. I'm not certain what that would amount to, right? I'm not certain. I'm not denying you're self-conscious. You are. But it's hard to understand what it would mean for you to separate yourself from yourself. Bodily, it's preposterous. But even with respect to, selfhood in the mode of immaterial consciousness, what would that mean? Here's the difficulty stated differently. No whole can distinguish itself as a whole from itself, and thus remain itself, right? So if you take a whole and chop it into 2 pieces, you have 2 halves. You don't have the whole duplicated. One half relates to the second half. That's not the whole relating to itself. So you can't take the whole self, and duplicate itself. Right? The self certainly can't do it, and nothing outside of the self can do it for the self. Okay, so that's really the end of the self-identification model. The SI model is dead. Okay. Nevertheless, let's go on. Let's pretend that's not a decisive objection. There's a second objection. Even if an individual could separate a self-instance from his own self and then set them opposite one another, he would still require a criterion, whereby he would know that separated self-instance is an instance of himself. Let's say you confronted a self in your consciousness. How would you know that's yourself? Well, you need some access to your own self so that you could check that self-instance you're confronting is actually yourself. You would already have to be self-conscious, do you get that? In order to identify that self-instance as yourself. Okay? That is, this criterion would be present in virtue of the self having already separated itself, right, from itself, and having identified the criterion as itself, right? So maybe it's worth emphasizing these words. So you have to have already made that separation. You could identify the criterion. Can you see the problem now? This pushes the question back one step. How does the self know that the criterion is a criterion of himself? Right? How does he know that? So you have a self who's trying to identify himself. He already has to be self-conscious in order to do that. So he's already divided himself from himself. But now he has to identify that criterion as indeed a criterion of himself. He can only do that if he's already divided himself against himself a second time, maybe a third time, right? But how is he going to identify that criterion as a criterion of himself? He needs a prior division. This is the fourth division, and so on. A fifth will be needed, and a sixth. Now, no one can perform such an infinite series, right? Because no infinite series can be realized in a finite time, and we're talking about human beings who are embedded and experience things in time. Further, no finite human intellect or mind can perform an infinite number of mental acts of any kind, whether of identification or anything else. So it's a second distinct problem, that self would not even be able to identify itself because it would need a criterion, and that's impossible because that would require an infinite regress. So let's put this to one side and imagine what it would be like simply to identify an instance of selfhood within the sphere of one's self-consciousness. Okay, we'll put aside objections 1 and 2. Let's say you identify selfhood within your self-consciousness. Still a major difficulty is that there would be no reason to take that instance of selfhood to be oneself. Just put the criterion to one side, right? As opposed to any other self in the whole world. It could be Nancy Pelosi you're confronting in your consciousness, right? It could be Lady Gaga. I guess you guys think she's old. For me, she's like a recent big star. I don't even know any of her songs. I think she had one called I Was Born That Way. Born kind of a strange gal, whatever I am. Maybe she's saying I was born, some people are born homosexual or something like that. Okay, that seems not to be true, by the way. Talk to good psychologists, including good homosexual psychologists. Right? There isn't much evidence that people are born that way. I can share the literature with you on that. Maybe you're confronting Elon Musk. You know him? Okay. Maybe you're confronting Tony Fauci. Who could be anyone in there, right? So the SI model of self-consciousness is false. The self-identification model is false. But as far as we know, there are only 2 models, friends. Okay, so let's move on to the self-constitution model. So if either can be defended at all, at this point, it would seem to be that model, the self-constitution model. So let's work at it. Who knows? Maybe that one will collapse as well. It may be the case that we're just not equipped to explain self-consciousness, right? You have to, we may end up with skepticism on this issue. You follow me? We may end up with skepticism, but clearly Hegel does not end up there. So you and I might end up there, but Hegel doesn't. Let's try to make sense of what he has to say. Hegel himself puts forward a self-constitution model of self-consciousness, no surprise. In this, I claim he followed Kant. So there's a link between Hegel and Kant. Okay, but also Fichte and Schelling. But he did not use this contemporary vocabulary that I'm using, right? But instead referred to this under the descriptive, and here you ran into this in your reading, particularly in the first couple of pages, of the return of consciousness to itself through its other. Right? So it's the return to itself through its other. You have to relate to other things in order to be self-conscious. Okay? There's no such thing as an immediate identification of yourself in abstraction from things around you. Or maybe it could be abstract objects, but you have to be thinking something. Either a concrete object like avocado, or an abstract object like the square root of 3, right? It has to be something you're entertaining. It could be the concept of God, right? It could be smell. It could be something. But it has to be something that you're entertaining, and then your self-consciousness emerges in and through and in virtue of a relation. Okay? Now, be careful here. Self-consciousness presupposes a relation to objects. You get that? That's the basic. I'll explain this further as we go through. Now you might want to say, oh, that makes my self-consciousness illusory because I have to be related to something else. I'm not really directly in relation to myself. No, because your relation to other things is real. So self-consciousness is based on a real relation, or a real network of relations, ultimately, to other things, and particularly to other persons and to institutions. And that'll be the key to understanding how Hegel develops his philosophy. Let's back up for a second here, see if we can approach this a bit more slowly. One way to get an initial grip on this is to understand this as a relational theory of self-consciousness. But it is not merely relational, as it is self-constitutional, right? In that it involves not merely a passive relation to things, Like if you were to put a mug on your kitchen table, then it will be related to the kitchen table in virtue of being on it. And it will be in a relatively passive relation to that table. But here, with self-constitution, there's an active, indeed, is a cognitive relation. Now, the mug definitely is not in a cognitive relation. Cognitive relation is one that involves truth and falsity. Okay, I'll explain how that is. When you constitute yourself as a self-conscious agent, you're in an active cognitive relation to things, and through that yourself comes to be a self at all. Right? It's in virtue of that active cognitive relation. Basically, it's about making truth claims and right assertions. And we'll see here that, and those are bound up. I mean, if you assert that you have a certain right to behave in a certain way, or a right over an object to use it and take it, you will, correct? You're at the same time asserting that your claim is true. Okay? So you can't make a right claim without making a truth claim. You can make a truth claim without making a right claim. You can claim that force equals mass times acceleration, right? Without claiming that you have any right concerning that matter. You can assert that force equals mass times acceleration divided by 2, which is false, right? Observation refutes that. But that has nothing to do with right. Okay, so let's move on. Again, here's a thought experiment that might help you get this. So it is in and through relating to objects which function like a mirror. Okay, so now if we use the concept of a mirror, that might help. It's in and through relating to objects which function like a mirror that induces one's face to come into being that self-consciousness occurs. It's a rather awkward sentence. So the idea is that you relate to an object. The object functions like a mirror, but it's a mirror that does not reflect your face. Because imagine that you had a mirror which constituted your face, right? What would that look like? So you wake up in the morning and you try to rub the sleep out of your eyes. Your eyes aren't there. Your face is a flat piece of flesh, right? Sorry for the disturbing image here, but you know your house or apartment, and so you leap out of bed and you rush to the closest mirror to see what happened to your face. As you look at your face, 2 little pinholes appear where your eyes are supposed to be and where your nostrils are supposed to be, where your mouth belongs, where your ears belong, and gradually your face starts articulating, right? So that would be a mirror that would cause you to have a face. Objects are things that cause your selfhood to come into articulation. Follow me? Because it's in virtue of your relating to objects that you come to think about rights and values. That's really the key there. And it's only in virtue of your thinking about rights and values, in virtue of your relationship to objects, yourself. Can I say that again? It's only in virtue of your thinking about rights and values, and ultimately truth, I should add that. It's only in virtue of your thinking about rights, values, and truth, through your relation to things, that you are a self at all. So that's the self-constitution part. That's the mirror function, right? If you've read Jacques Lacan, I'm not talking about his idea of the mirror function. I'm talking about Hegel's idea. I'm using this concept of a mirror in a way to explicate Hegel. He doesn't talk about mirrors in the text I gave you, right? Nor, as far as I know, anyplace else. But I think it's useful. So, here's a little thing about his theory of logic. We'll skip that. Self-consciousness constitutes itself in and through relation to objects and individuals. It has the form, therefore, of return to self through another, in which it determines itself to be under a norm, right? And we will see to be in relation to a certain value, and implicitly then to claim that its norm is true and its value is true. Right? Its norm assertion is true and its value assertion is true. Put that in. It seems pretty important. Okay, so violate a moral norm. What is a moral norm? It's something you're required to do. Any of the natural laws we look at is a moral norm. To violate one is to have done something wrong, right? So norms are real in the sense that if they exist, then if you violate one, you have done something wrong. And that fact then enters into your biography. It's an unexpungible fact, right? I mean, you can say you're sorry, you can be forgiven, you can resolve not to repeat the offense, and you can succeed at not repeating it. All those things can be true, and nonetheless you did it, right? And it becomes part of your story. That's why, it's kind of tough to make a really immoral decision that ends up defining you in a way, right? And it being defined by it. So that's why it's wise not to make certain decisions, so you're not defined by them. One can cheat on one's wife, right? But then you're an adulterer. That's it. If you read the novel A Crime and Punishment, there's an individual who has the opportunity to basically take a lot of money from a woman who causes nothing but pain and grief in others. He has to kill her to get it, right? And so he thinks, I can take this money, I can do a lot of good with this. I can, set up an orphanage. I can, educate children. I can. My sister is being forced to marry some gorilla of a man. He's rich, but he's a miserable person. I can get her out of that situation, right? And so he does it. Guess what happens? He finds out that his life has changed completely because now he's a murderer, right? All right. So back to self-consciousness. Self-conscious experience takes the form of reasoning. So when you're reasoning, you're self-conscious. Now, reasoning normally doesn't have any kind of feel to it. I think sometimes it has a little bit of a feel to it for me. I think for some other people, but normally, you can say 2 + 2 = 4, which is mathematical reasoning. And maybe your body feels a certain way. Like, oh, by the way, I'm sorry I'm doing this late. I just kind of collapsed physically yesterday. It's not COVID or anything. I just been pressing myself so hard. My body just said I can't do it anymore, and so I got a splitting headache and I couldn't move. So I'm sorry, doing this one day late. So reasoning doesn't have a feel to it, but it's self-conscious. Then there's sensation. Sensation's interesting because a sensation has the attribute we say today, transparency, right? So when you look at an object, the properties you are aware of are properties of the object. That's what that means, rather than properties of your self-consciousness, or properties of your consciousness, right? Your consciousness tends to recede and vanish in favor of the properties of sensed objects. It's a remarkable phenomenon. It's as if your self-consciousness is virtually nothing. I had an old advisor who used to make a lot out of that. Stanley Rosen, he's worth reading. And then takes the form of emotions. I mean, what in the world is an emotion? Well, an emotion is a felt response to objects or states of affairs or persons, right? Which we take to be justified or unjustified, which normally motivates some kind of action, right? And that's that. They seem to be related to judgments somehow. So, little babies and dogs experience emotions, and it's doubtful that they form judgments. So emotions are interesting, and those fall in the sphere of self-consciousness. And then there's this thing we call desire. Okay? Desire is even more basic than the emotions. By the way, emotions and desire, these are features of the passions. These are 2 categories of passion. All right? All right. So it's interesting because desire itself might be divided in various ways. There are run-of-the-mill desires, but maybe sexual desire is a particular category of desire, or both an intensification and a specification of desire. Who knows? I'm working that out with my students, my other course where we're talking about these things. So amongst these, desire is arguably the simplest form or instance of self-consciousness. But what's more basic than desire? Now, desire is fascinating because you're always desiring. Get that? You always desire something. Otherwise, you wouldn't move. You're saying, well, sometimes I fall asleep. I'm not conscious during periods of my sleep. Yeah, I guess during those periods of unconsciousness, you're not desiring anything, as far as I know. When you start dreaming, you start desiring again. But whenever you're having conscious experiences, it seems to be that desire is there, involved in motivating you to do things. Isn't that interesting? That's why he says self-consciousness is desire in general. Do you recall that sentence? Self-consciousness is desire in general. Okay. So let's talk about desire a little bit more carefully. start with, we have to distinguish human desire from animal impulse. Now, we have animal impulses. Right? I mean, we have a kind of animal nature. But our desire, not to mention our other faculties of emotion, sensation, reason, supervene over our animal impulses. Like, let me give you an example of an animal impulse. You're standing next to the road, and then the bus drives by you at incredible speed. It misses you by about 3 inches. Right? What do? You instinctively kind of move back without thinking about it. So that's a survival impulse, right? An impulse towards self-preservation. We have those. And strictly speaking, animals do not have desires, though. Okay? You're saying, well, that doesn't make any sense because my dog certainly desires his dog food. Okay, but then we're using the word a little bit loosely. We have to draw a distinction here. Now, take, for example, a beaver. What are the impulses of a beaver? Build a dam, eat bark, cuddle with Mrs. Beaver, etc. Animal impulses are always particular and specific, right? Should emphasize these words here, right? Always particular, always specific. That is, they are directed at specific objects and states of affairs. There was no room for changing them, right? You can't like approach a beaver and say, listen, aren't you sick of building dams? Wouldn't you like to try something else? Get in the car. Come on, I'll take you for a spin. I can take you out, introduce you to some people. Maybe we can put our heads together and come up with a different life, something more satisfying. And there's never been a beaver that's been hanging out and saying, listen, I'm sick of doing this. I think I want to do something else. I want to be a poet. Okay? I mean, it's not open to beavers, but it's open to us. The human desire is wholly different. It is changeable and more general, right? It has the character of relating to an object pole that is relatively open. So we can choose a variety of things. You don't have to desire to build a dam. You become the kind of engineer who builds dams. You'll do it, and normally you will desire to do it. You'll be in situations where you'll desire to do it. You can desire to write music. You can desire to become an accountant. You can desire to get married, have children, and take care of your kids. You can desire to spend all of your time praying. You can desire to put your shoulder to the wheel for a global world state. And you can desire all sorts of things. For this reason, we can suggest that human desire always already exhibits the character of human freedom. That's interesting. It opens up freedom. Isn't that an interesting observation? So Hegel seems to have discovered this. That human desire is an anticipation of freedom. It's open. It's open to any object. So it sets up the possibility of freedom. It's a necessary condition for the development of freedom. So we can change our desires. Granted, that can be difficult, right? There's some desires which seem to have a grip on us. So consider the phenomenon of an acquired taste, however, right? Maybe you don't like Greek tragedy right now. You study it, and you acquire the taste for it. I had a friend who told me, at first he wasn't a big fan of Greek tragedy, then he acquired the taste. Let's see. Something's wrong with the spelling here. There we go. I think, in my case, at first I didn't like bebop too much. And then I acquired a taste for it. And then later I really like it. And then I learned how to play it, So you can acquire a taste. You can change your desires. So let's turn to the next question here. What is the essential object of desire? Now, some people say it's pleasure. Now, do we remember a thinker who said that pleasure is the essential object of desire? Yeah, we do. John Stuart Mill. And I had a specific objection against that. I can restate it and say that it gives us the implication of that is that human beings have no value, and that leaves us with no motive to help anybody. Right? That's a restatement of my difficulty with Mill. I'm saying it slightly differently, and it reflects something I said in the second version of the lecture, the one I didn't read from. Okay. Others say it's existence, right? Very good. Nietzsche would say it's power. So I would say, others power, others satisfaction. Get that? So let's think about these. Let's look at the sacrifice argument here. The sacrifice argument addresses the Millian utilitarian thesis that you can only desire pleasure, and whatever is instrumental for pleasure. Pleasure is the ultimate aim of everything. So if pleasure is the essential object of desire, then it should be impossible for a person to sacrifice pleasure for the sake of money, honor, or power. But people do, in fact, sacrifice pleasure for one or another of these things, for money, honor, or power. You know, they work late into the night, even push themselves, feeling quite crushed, and just keep working, right, for like more money, or for more honor, or more power, or all three. Their lives are quite miserable, and they keep doing it. So no, pleasure is not the essential object of desire. You can sacrifice pleasure for other things. So that's not it. How about existence? If existence is the essential object of desire, right? It's the object that cannot be separated from desire. That is what you desire. Period. Then suicide would be impossible, right? Because a suicide desires not to exist. He has a different object of desire. He desires self-annihilation. Suicide, unfortunately, occurs. Therefore, existence is not essential, not the essential object of desire. So we can add one about, about power. Argument number 3, the how about the abdication argument? What would this look like? So this is against Nietzsche, right? So premise number 1: if power is the essential object of desire, then no monarch would have ever voluntarily abdicated. Okay? But some monarchs have indeed voluntarily abdicated, for the sake of preserving their own lives when they were under too much pressure, and they decided to elevate existence as their aim. Because you're free to choose existence as your aim. So it's not the essential object, but you're free to choose it. So for the sake of preserving their own lives, or for the sake of a forbidden love, right? We have a case of that, etc. Hold on a second. Let's see here. Is that going to work? I can't really do much about that. That's stuck there. Okay, so we're left with this, guys. The essential aim of desire is satisfaction. But that's radically abstract. That's generic. So anything can fit in there. You might find power satisfying. You're free to pursue power if you like. You might take satisfaction in making a lot of money. Like Wall Street guys who compete with one another to see who can, make the most. Investors. You have these guys with $10 billion, and for some reason, they have 10, they want 20. They don't need more money, obviously. They just them as a hobby, as it were. So it's beyond a hobby; it's a way of life. Or you can make comfort, pleasure, pleasant life. You can go with Mill there and pursue refined pleasures. So there are various kinds of satisfaction. And the thing is, some people take, as I said, some people take pleasure to be the essential object of desire. What they miss is that can't be the case. Pleasure seems to be the essential object of desire because satisfaction is, right? Because if you satisfy your desire, that itself is pleasant. Get that? Not always pleasant, but often when you satisfy your desire, the satisfaction itself is pleasant. Even saying it, satisfaction is pleasant. It's a kind of feeling. I don't know if it's an emotion, but it's a feeling. It has an emotion type quality to it, doesn't it? So if you satisfy your desire, then that feels good, right? So desire is essentially satisfaction seeking. Okay. It's essentially that doesn't mean it's pleasure seeking, right? You guys get the difference? So you get the satisfaction, and the consequence of that is pleasure. It doesn't mean you're thinking about the pleasure. Your satisfaction may come in the form of getting the corner office. Now, it doesn't always work, right? Because sometimes you satisfy your desire, you get the corner office, and you plunk down to the chair, and you get depressed because you realize it wasn't worth it. It's a very commonly reported experience. A lot of people, they struggle, They go for years fighting for that corner office. They finally get there. They have the $120,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year job, and there's nothing satisfying about it. I mean, they were sold a bill of goods. It's a very common report and experience. So don't succumb to the illusion, right? So I mean, maybe there's a job with a corner office with which you can do good work. I hope you get that one if that's what you want to do. So what is satisfying, right? That's whatever the agent represents as satisfying. Whatever that is desired, right? When he achieves it, as I said, he does not necessarily experience satisfaction in the sense of something pleasant, right? Okay. He doesn't experience it. That's interesting. So we'd have to, if we had a full philosophy of desire here, we'd have to think about that more carefully. So, desire is oriented towards satisfaction, and the category of the satisfying operates like a placeholder or a variable into which can be plugged an indefinite number of objects and states of affairs, right? So this object is the satisfying. What is that? It's whatever's plugged in there. Now, I would say this, natural need tends to compel one to adopt certain objects as satisfying, right? You have a need for food, so you have no choice effectively but to desire food, right? You also have a need for shelter, for protection from the elements, so you have no choice but to desire clothing and shelter, a roof over your head. There's another interesting one, because without those things, without food, clothing, and shelter, your life's going to become much shorter. The sexual impulse can grip people with a kind of quasi-necessity. They feel like it has to be satisfied, right? But if it's not, they're not going to die, right? I mean, but if they go without food, they're dead. Long enough, they're dead. If you go without water, very quickly you're gone. And if you are living out in the open, like no tent or anything, just kind of you just lay down anywhere, you're going to get beaten up pretty quickly. I would say your life's going to be much shorter, particularly here in the Northeast. You're probably not going to get through the winter, right? So now we should analyze the conceptual structure of desire on the basis of its connection with satisfaction. So we've proved that desire takes satisfaction as its aim. Now let's take some more analytical steps forward here. If an agent desires something, then he is virtually by definition dissatisfied. Make sense? So if you're desiring something, you're dissatisfied. Have you had the experience of sitting down or standing and feeling dissatisfied? And you ask yourself, what is it that I want? You didn't even know. You said, I don't even know what I want. I know I'm dissatisfied. I can't even name what it is I want. That happens. When you reach my stage in life, that tends not to happen, by the way, because one just has too many responsibilities, and that sort of thing goes away. Bad moods go away at my stage of life. Okay, who has time for a bad mood? I don't. Go away. Impossible. So we can propose that desire has the following structure, right? So in terms of certain necessary categories of desire, determine how an agent experiences his own desire. Okay, so here's the idea here. So desire has certain categories that frame the conscious experience or the self-conscious experience of desiring, okay? Satisfaction is one of them, and dissatisfaction is another. We'll come back to that. These categories determine, they frame, and they give structure to how an agent experiences those desires that occur as conscious experiences. So Hegel calls the tripartite categorical structure of a thing a syllogism. So he's taking the concept of a syllogism and he's adapting it to his purposes. So let's look at one particular structure that we can attribute to desire. So normally, a person desiring something is dissatisfied with respect to his possessing the object of desire, having achieved it. Now, by object, we don't mean necessarily like a mug or a tree. The object can be any object of consciousness. It can be a state of affairs, right? So the state of affairs might be being the guy who gets the corner office and the job of chief financial officer for his organization. So anything you can think about, that would be an object. That's what we mean by that. It could also be an object. It could also be like a pear. You can desire a pear. Or you could say that what you really desire is to eat the pear. That would be a state of affairs analysis of an object. By the way, in the philosophy of desire, many philosophers believe that you have to desire a state of affairs. That's a real object. You desire to have and to eat the pear, or to have and to occupy the corner office. You don't just desire the corner office or desire the pear. Okay, that's a fine point. So the person who's desiring is in a state of dissatisfaction. He's projecting a future action. You get that? So he's projecting a future satisfaction, such wise that he takes it to be a certain object. What this thing in the middle here is a kind of lens through which our dissatisfied agent, right, interprets his projected satisfaction. So at the present moment, say you want to eat a muffin, you're dissatisfied. Probably has made you hungry, right? So you're dissatisfied because you want that muffin. So you're projecting. Built into desire is the projection of a future. Get that? And it's the projection of a future in which you're satisfied with respect to a specific object of consciousness, like a state of affairs. You're eating the muffin. Okay? So the dissatisfied agent identifies his satisfaction as this is. We have to really dig into this because you'll miss it unless you think about this. The dissatisfied agent identifies his satisfaction as a specific object, right? Because the idea here is that we're taking desire in as abstraction, right? We're going to imagine a being who's nothing but desire. That was the point of that first little you read in the section chapter 4, the Phenomenology of Spirit. We're talking about a being who has not been given any kind of moral training, has not even been taught how to speak. He himself is desire, right? If he is desire, he's going to experience things in accordance with the syllogism of desire. He'll be dissatisfied. The dissatisfaction itself involves rejection of a future satisfaction. Dissatisfaction aims at his own negation, right? One way of looking at it. Dissatisfaction aims at its own negation and satisfaction. And it aims at its own negation and satisfaction via some object of consciousness. Let's say it's eating a muffin. Okay? So, given that we're talking about desire as such, without any kind of set of moral norms or moral values by which to evaluate the desire and to evaluate the object of the desire, right? What it's going to do is it's going to identify satisfaction as this object. It'll be totally and completely absorbed with it. Okay? In this state of consciousness, an individual does not integrate the object of desire into a wider system of values and say, okay, I'm going to prioritize now. This is, I'll assign this some degree of importance. But if someone were just desire, what they would do is they would end up being completely obsessed with that object, as it were. They would have no term of comparison. They don't as yet have any system of values within which to place the object. I think that people in advertising try to induce this kind of consciousness. They try to get people to desire objects in a non-integrative way. They try to present each object as if it itself were the self-actualization and joy and happiness. That's sort of the key to advertising. Without this toothpaste, your life's gonna fall apart completely. Or this car, this is the key. This watch, right? And it's a cacophony of absolutely preposterous claims that all these individual objects itself has a kind of virtually magical power of making you completely and utterly fulfilled. All right. So this I would call the syllogism of absorption, being absorbed with the object. Makes sense in the case of romantic love also, when one person looks upon another person as his or her all, right? Okay. They were experiencing something like this. State of dissatisfaction, looking on at the other person as satisfying, and taking that person taking that satisfaction as that specific person. There's nothing else that could provide that satisfaction. Okay. All right. Surely there's more going on in romantic love, but I'll leave it at that for the moment. And then you can flip, right? We have these three categories here. So if the dissatisfied agent is to understand his satisfaction, he has to understand it as this object. But how is he going to understand the object if he wanted to understand that independently? He would understand the object via the lens or through the lens of satisfaction. So he would take this object as essentially what is satisfying for himself. Right? That sounds like romantic love too, right? So, somebody who is romantically in love sort of assumes that the other person exists for him or for her. As if anybody interfered with that, that would cause, problem. Okay, so this is the syllogism of egoism. I call this the syllogism of egoism. Okay. This object exists for me, essentially. Get that? Now, what is satisfying for me is essentially this object right here. That's absorption or obsession. So or infatuation, any of those words. The upshot is desire as such, prior to rational reflection and the achievement of moral and ethical habits, basically a framework within which you can evaluate your desires, is egoistic absorption with an object. Egoistic absorption with an object. So I think this is really, now you're saying, Dr. Schicker, where's this stuff in the text? I'm pulling this out of the text because Hegel's language is very foreign to us, and it's difficult to interpret. And I'm taking his ideas and I'm translating them into contemporary philosophical jargon, which is a bit easier to get. All right. Because desire as such is independent of reason and utterly abstract. It does not subject its categorical determinations, as opposed to self-conscious moral judgment, right? Any kind of rational criticism or limitation. That's interesting. Since one above, in effect, determines the object to appear as the absolute good. That's interesting. This is the birth of homo religiosus. I mean, human beings are by nature oriented towards the absolute good. So we're always seeking the absolute good, right? Now, of course, we can build a system of values and then weigh one good against another. And we can do that. I think it's possibly even possible to forget about the absolute good. I think of, some people in my years of acquaintances may at least have claimed to achieve something like that. But the orientation towards the absolute good is built into us insofar as there's always possible that we have a non-integrated desire. You get that? That is a desire that has not been integrated into and evaluated in light of a system of values where you prioritize. Prioritization is the key there. Second, the second syllogism, in effect, determines that the agent assign himself an unlimited right, right? That's the key there. It's unlimited. That work? He assigns himself an unlimited right because he hasn't put the claim that the object exists for him. He hasn't limited that with reference to a scheme of rights and duties. And he hasn't said, of course I have the duty not to assault people. Of course I have the duty not to steal from people. Of course I have the duty, to respect people. He's not conscious of any of that. So the right he assigns himself is unlimited. So this is the kind of being. So if he sees a car and he likes the car, he desires the car, he takes the car. That's the end of that, right? This would be not a socially functional person. So Hegel, hence, desire taken abstractly, that is, desire as desire, produces the appearance of an absolute good over which the desiring agent exercises an unlimited right. You might say that desire is a form of almost natural ignorance because you're bound to get this wrong. You're bound to get this wrong if you're stuck in the state of desiring, or if advertisers induce in me or in you kind of non-integrated desire where we become obsessed with a particular object. There's a good film that captures this phenomenon. It's called Confessions of a Shopaholic. I mean, the film isn't that good, but I think it does a good job at one thing, at representing this person who just, as soon as she sees something, some consumer object, she absolutely has to have it. She becomes obsessed with it, right? Again and again and again. All right. So the book unrealistically has, or the film unrealistically has, a happy ending. So let's take this a bit further now. What does it mean to have an unlimited right over an object? Now, you guys picked up where Hegel was talking about self-consciousness involving violence, right? So let's try to figure out how that fits in, because you deduce it from these considerations. So that's why I'm confident that I'm actually explicating Hegel, because as I work it through step by step, I arrive at the exact same conclusions he did, only I actually explain how you get there, right? As opposed to just restating them or just going with the flow and not asking any questions. So not to pat myself on the back, but I find in the literature, no one has done this. So you guys haven't lost much sleep in your lives thinking about the true interpretation of Hegel. But I say this is a contender here. I'm not perfect, and I'm not important. But I might have the right way of reading this text. But if one has an unlimited right over an object, what does one have a right to do to that object, right? You have an unlimited right. You can do whatever you want to it. You can destroy it. That's the extreme. Here's an argument for you. If one has an effective right, and knows it. What if you had a right to $1 million from somebody's account? You didn't know you had that right, and no one was ever going to tell you. You set things up so you'll never find out. What would be the good of that right? It would be ineffective. It would be an ineffective right. So if you have one that's actually effective, you have to know it. That argument I gave you is invalid, but nonetheless, it suggests a thought, right? If one has an effective right, then one knows it. If one knows that one has a right, then one has to act on it. I mean, how do you know you have a right unless you act on it? How can you know it? You can't know it, can you? Unless you act on it. What if I give you a right now to come borrow my SUV for the weekend? How do you know I'm serious, right? I mean, you'd actually have to test that right. You have to show up at my door and say, hey, can I borrow the SUV for the weekend? And then gave it to you, then you'd say, oh yeah, wow, Dr. Shakir actually gave me that right. So if one knows, I probably can't afford to do that, guys, sorry. If one knows that one has a right, then one has to act on it. Okay, get that? Desire as such involves the consciousness of an effective right to destroy the object. So if one has an effective right to destroy the object, one knows one has that right. And if one knows one has that right, one has to act on it. Therefore, desire will pursue the destruction of object after object, because as it focuses on one object after another, it destroys each of them. So in this case, object does mean an actual concrete thing. So in this particular case, the primitive case of desire takes the form of destroying one thing after another. Think about kids on a playground. They just kind of kill insects just for the hay of it. They're exercising their right. That's their desire functioning abstractly, one insect after another. They don't care. They're entertaining themselves by destroying one object after another because of this syllogism. Well, it's not a syllogism, because of this argument here. It's one way of taking it. Maybe there's something else going on there. What is going on here is that an agent whose moral status, now this is the next thing here, a question of moral status, because an individual who hasn't yet established his right has his moral status suspended. Get that? Through desiring, one is making a right claim, and one is situating oneself as a right-bearing agent. So you desire to have some coffee, say, right? You pour the coffee in the mug, you pick up the coffee, you drink the coffee. You are asserting through your action your right to drink that coffee, and you are constituting yourself as a moral being with moral status, indeed with normative status, being with a right to do what you're doing. Get that? There's always more at stake in performing an action than simply satisfying, a desire for pleasure or achieving some particular aim. You're always constituting yourself as a moral agent. Get that? When you drink a cup of coffee, you're constituting yourself as a moral agent with a right over that coffee. When you eat a muffin, you're constituting yourself as a moral agent with a right to eat that muffin. When you talk to your friend, you're constituting yourself as a moral agent with a right to be in a conversation with your friend. You get on the bus, right? You're constituting yourself as a moral agent with a right to get on that bus. It could also sound a little assertive, but normally we don't think about the fact that we're constituting ourselves as moral agents in that way. But there is a kind of implicit right claim that goes along with performing those actions. That's Hegel's big insight. One of his many big insights. He has a lot of big insights. Sort of like the Wile E. Coyote of modern philosophy. He has one penetrating insight after another. Okay, so again, what is going on here is that an agent whose moral status is at issue and who can fail to achieve moral status. That's the other part here. You know, if your moral status is in suspense and at stake, you can fail to achieve it. Like, what if you were enslaved and you were deprived access to coffee, right? You can lose that. So, this agent, in the act of desiring and in pursuing the satisfaction of his desire, right, seeks to constitute his moral status as a being with a right over some object. It can be just implicit, but it's there in the action as a whole. It's straight away implicit because it's all expressed in action. It's all. I mean, this self-conscious claim making to one's having a right over object that is expressed, asserted in the act of moving from point A to point B and grabbing the object and eating it. Okay. So, if you will, each human being is in himself. In the first instance, he's a zero status being, right? Who can achieve through his own effort actualization of his status. He can achieve status. He can actualize status through effort, through an act in which he demonstrates his right over an object. Okay? That's the idea. This is what Hegel saw. I think it's a pretty brilliant idea. I mean, that's why I chose to teach it to you, right? So, if there were a person who was simply desire as such, then whatever the aim of his desire was, he would immediately adopt that aim. Follow? What if you were just desire, without any kind of moral training, you know, no civilization whatsoever? As soon as you desired something, you yourself would adopt the aim of that desire. So that's not like us, and we're not like that at all. We can reflect on and choose not to act on certain desires unless some advertiser has brainwashed us. So let's look at this. These different syllogisms here, because there are other ones. What if you begin in the state of satisfaction? You're not desiring anything, right? But in that state, you want to avoid dissatisfaction. Okay? You might take some object. You can experience that dissatisfaction as given in a certain object, which you don't want. For example, the object would be the state of affairs of being fired from your job. You lose a corner office. So I call this the syllogism of absorptive aversion. So this defines what we have an aversion to. What you're afraid of, because fear is different. Fear is different, a different sort of passion. This is aversion. Aversion is just a desire to flee something. And then you can flip the object here and dissatisfaction here. So now, your state of satisfaction, you're considering the object. And this is not happening in your intellect, okay? I mean, this is happening in the level of desire itself. So that's important. This is a kind of categorical phenomenology of desire. Phenomenology has to do with experience. It's a categorical because these are categories. So this is a categorical phenomenology of desire as such. This is occurring. You know those gut feelings you get and stuff like that? We're talking about the structure of those here. Or maybe gut feelings isn't the right thing, but that helps in maybe giving you a specimen of something more basic than thinking, right? That would have a structure. Desire is like gut feeling, right? And it has a categorical structure. And you can be conscious of your desires. Most often you're not. You can be. You know you can be. Sometimes you have a strong desire, right? I really want to get out of here, right? So if you're in a state of satisfaction, how do you consider the object? You can consider it through the lens of dissatisfaction. You can say, this is essentially dissatisfying for me. I mean, this is something I hate. I mean, so call this the syllogism of egoistic aversion. I know a woman dislikes raspberry jam so much. If anybody shows up with raspberry jam, she flies into a rage. What's the big deal? We have grape jelly. We have some orange marmalade. No. So the raspberry jam for her is something that is essentially dissatisfying for her. No one's allowed to have any ever again. Okay? What would happen if one desire confronted another desire? That's interesting. Okay? What if one desire confronted another desire? Each would assert an absolute right over the other, and violence would ensue. You get that? I have some stuff here by a guy named René Girard, but we're going to get to him some other time. So this will be my first installment on Hegel. This kind of sets things up, and then I'll give you another lecture. I want to do that one tomorrow. So let me let you bite down on this one. You might have to listen to this lecture twice in order to get it. I'll be sending another your way. Be well.